Yeah.
Do we have a presentation, Mr. Duane? Or just questions? I think we're just taking questions. Passes. This is a passed item. So, Mr. Labarge.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. William Labarge, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 16. And through you, Madam Moderator, I'd like to ask if this feasibility study is done and conclude that a skate park cannot be done. I'm just curious, what reason would that come?
What reason?
Yeah, if the feasibility, what reason would they envision would come that would say that this skate park cannot be built?
Mr. Halpin, to answer the question.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Bob Halpin, Town Manager. This is actually an appropriation which is required and necessary and very important to assess the environmental conditions that exist at the Mary Dennison Playground. It was originally proposed as the first step to assessing the feasibility of locating a skateboard park because there's been a long history of awareness that there are environmental concerns at Mary Dennison Park. For the benefit of the larger audience, and we can switch to the second slide, the park is actually constructed at the site of a former landfill. There's some confusion as to whether or not it was a Town of Framingham municipal landfill or a dump operated by Avery Dennison. Certainly the Mass Department of Environmental Protection recognizes Avery Dennison Corporation as a responsible party. And my guess is that there's probably a history here of Avery Dennison and the town having used this location as a dumping ground until the late 50s, early 60s, at which point it was clearly conveyed to the town. It came to the town supposedly, or at the time the park was constructed, supposedly with about a 2 to 4 foot fill layer, which was intended to separate the old dump from what would ever happen on top. And then, of course, the park is built on top of that. This is an interesting, 1971 is a significant year in the history of landfills. It was a year in which DEP changed their approach to requiring liners under landfills and then how you capped it when you were done with it. So in the mind of DEP, the fact that this was a landfill prior to 1971 is significant. In 1990, there were concerns expressed about the landfill. They were conveyed to the Bureau of Solid Waste within DEP. There was some interchange between the town's licensed site professional, but in the minds of the Bureau of Solid Waste, it was closed out as a grandfathered landfill that was treated accordingly. There were further concerns expressed over the years as basketball courts and playgrounds were added. We're continuing back and forth with DEP. And then ultimately, in the preparation for proposing a feasibility study leading to consideration of a skateboard park, the Director of Parks and Recreation began scoping out what kind of assessment would be needed of the soils to support a feasibility study for the skateboard park. As that progressed, it became clearer and clearer from Weston & Sampson, the engineering firm that he was working with, that there was in fact this open concern at DEP, and they recommended that he proceed to file a notice of what's technically called a notice of release. That led to a filing of a notice of release in February and some testing of the soils. And this chart that you see above you shows 15 soil boring locations that were conducted in March of this year, one of which goes somewhere between 3 to 5 feet in depth. And if we have the, do we have the, oh, here it is. And that deep well actually is this dot right here. That revealed at a depth of about 3 to 5 feet some elevated lead in the soil, but as we said, 3 to 5 feet deep. And then there are 2 locations here and I believe here within the top 3 feet of the fill layer where there were elevated concentrations of lead and some other heavy metals. Those that significantly exceeded the standard were in this lead category. There were also about here and here, this location, and then this location, some concentrations of what are known as polyacrylic hydrocarbons. These are evidence of some not fully combusted material, and in the opinion of the licensed site professional who works for the Board of Health, when they're at low levels of concentration similar to what we found, it's kind of indicative of coal ash. So there's some indication that there's some coal ash in this fill layer. There were then samples that were taken in the top 12 inches that were really the area that we were interested in assessing. And there were two locations in which lead was at elevated locations in the fill layer, and that is here and here. So these conditions, and then I might add that we took special precaution around the 3 baseball diamonds and took samples within the top 6 inches of the soil at the baseball diamond on the theory that that's probably where children might have the most active contact with the soil. And there were no concerns that exceeded standards in either of those baseball diamonds. So this brings us to a filing that was made in February, a determination of responsibility that issued in early March from the Mass Department of Environmental Protection. We now have an obligation to fully characterize the site, including what might be in the landfill underneath the park, as well as a more complete risk characterization of what this means for the surrounding neighborhood. So this is largely an effort now to comply with that requirement, and that needs to be completed between now and February 27, 2015. We've built in a layer on top of this where at the end or as part of this process, we can conduct a complete needs assessment of what the community would like at the park, including a skateboard park or any other recreational improvement that might better serve this neighborhood. So I hope that represents this was originally proposed at $40,000, and we increased it to $60,000 to assure that we could complete at least that requirement between now and February 27th, when we need to report back to DEP on the characterization of the site.
Thank you, Mr. Halpin. Are there any other town meeting members wishing?
Carries over from the original proposal, but if you read the description of the project, this is an environmental assessment and a community needs analysis. The environmental assessment is a mandatory action that we are now obligated to take under the jurisdiction of the Mass Department of Environmental Protection that will characterize the site and evaluate its risk to the neighborhood. That work will be done under the supervision of a licensed site professional that works directly with our Board of Health, and that needs to be done. So the lion's share of this appropriation is not a feasibility study. It's an environmental assessment of the site in terms of what's there and what the risk is. We put on top of that a community needs assessment where we can work closely with the neighborhood to figure out what they would like the park to be. In terms of liability, the Board of Health did send out the soil data to a health risk assessor, and in the opinion of that health risk assessor, the park does not at this point represent a safety risk to the users of the park.
Thank you, Mr. Halpin.